Infantry. When people think of Nazi Germany's military power, they often picture tanks, dive bombers, or elite units. But the real backbone of the German war machine was far more ordinary and far more numerous. It was the infantry. From the invasion of Poland in 1939 to the ruins of Berlin in 1945, German infantrymen carried the weight of the war on their shoulders. At the height of the conflict, more than 3 million infantry soldiers served simultaneously across multiple fronts. They marched, fought, froze, and bled in environments ranging from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests outside Moscow. A standard German infantry division early in the war consisted of roughly 17,000 men, equipped primarily with bolt-action rifles, light machine guns, mortars, and horse-drawn transport. Despite the image of a fully mechanized army, nearly 80% of German divisions relied on horses, not trucks, to move supplies. Speed came from discipline and planning, not engines. Infantry units were expected to hold ground at all costs. During Operation Barbarossa, entire divisions advanced hundreds of miles on foot, only to be ordered to stand and fight through the Russian winter. Casualties were staggering. By the end of 1941 alone, German infantry losses on the Eastern Front exceeded 800,000 killed, wounded, or missing, while Soviet losses ran into the millions. Yet, infantry was not just about endurance. German tactics emphasized small unit coordination, aggressive maneuvering, and relentless pressure. Squad-level machine guns formed the heart of every attack, turning ordinary foot soldiers into a highly effective combat system. In the end, no matter how advanced the weapons became, the war was decided by men on foot, because territory is never truly taken until infantry stands on it. Light infantry. Not all infantry in the German army marched in heavy columns with long supply trains. Some units were designed to move faster, lighter, and smarter. This was where light infantry came in. Light infantry formations were built for terrain where standard infantry struggled: dense forests, rolling hills, broken ground, and narrow roads. Their organization deliberately reduced heavy equipment: fewer artillery pieces, fewer transport wagons, and more emphasis on foot mobility allowed them to operate where vehicles became a liability. Early in the war, light infantry divisions typically fielded around 14,000 men, slightly fewer than standard infantry. What they lacked in weight, they compensated for in flexibility. These units relied heavily on small unit leadership, patrols, and rapid repositioning. A platoon commander often had far more tactical freedom than in regular infantry formations. Their value became clear during campaigns in the Balkans and Eastern Front forests, where roads vanished and visibility collapsed. In 1941, light infantry units advancing through wooded regions of the Soviet Union often covered terrain that mechanized forces simply could not access. In these environments, speed and awareness mattered more than armor. Casualties, however, were relentless. Light infantry lacked the firepower to absorb prolonged frontal assaults. During sustained defensive actions, some divisions suffered over 50% losses within a single year, forcing repeated reorganizations. Despite this, light infantry played a crucial role in plugging gaps, screening flanks, and stabilizing collapsing fronts. They were not elite troops, but they were adaptable, and adaptability became priceless as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated. In many ways, light infantry represented a quiet admission: the war could no longer be fought only with brute force. Survival increasingly depended on moving where the enemy least expected and holding on with whatever strength remained. Mountain infantry. If light infantry struggled in forests, mountain infantry were sent where even forests ended, into the mountains. These units were trained to fight in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth: steep slopes, thin air, freezing temperatures, and supply lines that could collapse overnight were part of daily life. Unlike standard infantry, mountain infantry had to master climbing, skiing, and high-altitude survival before they ever fired a shot in combat. A typical mountain infantry division fielded around 13,000 to 15,000 men, slightly smaller than regular infantry. Their equipment reflected their environment. Artillery was lighter and often broken down into pack loads. Supplies were frequently carried by mules rather than trucks, allowing units to move along narrow mountain paths that vehicles could never reach. Their most demanding campaigns came in places like Norway, the Balkans, and later the Caucasus Mountains. During the 1942 push toward the Caucasus oil fields, mountain infantry units advanced into elevations exceeding 10,000 feet, operating at the edge of human endurance. Combat losses were compounded by frostbite, avalanches, and exhaustion. In some formations, non-combat casualties rivaled those caused by enemy fire. Mountain infantry were not designed for rapid breakthroughs. Instead, their value lay in holding key passes, dominating high ground, and denying the enemy movement routes. A small unit positioned correctly could block an entire valley, forcing opposing armies to reroute or halt altogether. As the war turned defensive, these troops became anchors in collapsing fronts, clinging to terrain that offered natural protection when manpower and firepower ran short. In mountain warfare, geography itself became a weapon, and mountain infantry were trained to wield it. Mechanized infantry. As the war expanded and battlefields grew wider, German commanders realized that infantry on foot could no longer keep up with tanks. The answer was mechanized infantry, soldiers designed to move, fight, and survive alongside armored forces. Unlike standard infantry, mechanized infantry traveled by trucks or armored half-tracks, allowing them to advance at the same pace as tanks. A typical division fielded around 14,000 to 16,000 men, but its real strength lay in mobility and coordination. Infantry no longer arrived hours or days after the breakthrough. They were there immediately, securing ground that tanks alone could not hold. This concept became critical during early campaigns in France and the Soviet Union, where speed decided entire battles. Mechanized infantry dismounted under fire, cleared anti-tank positions, protected flanks, and pushed forward while armor continued the advance. When properly supported, these units could overwhelm defenders before they had time to react. However, the system had a weakness: it was resource-hungry. Half-tracks, fuel, spare parts, and trained crews were all in short supply. In reality, only a fraction of mechanized infantry units were fully equipped with armored transports. Many rode into battle on ordinary trucks or marched when vehicles broke down. Casualties were heavy. Fighting at the spearhead meant absorbing counterattacks at close range. During major offensives such as Kursk in 1943, mechanized infantry units suffered devastating losses as Soviet defenses absorbed the initial shock and struck back with overwhelming force. Despite these losses, mechanized infantry represented the peak of German combined arms doctrine. It was the moment infantry stopped chasing tanks and started fighting as part of the same weapon. Paratroopers. Among all German infantry types, paratroopers stood apart, not because of what they carried, but because of where they came from. They didn't advance from trenches or vehicles, they fell from the sky. German paratroopers were trained for surprise, speed, and shock. Selection was strict, training was brutal. A single jump could scatter units across miles, forcing small groups to fight isolated and outnumbered. Success depended on initiative, discipline, and sheer nerve. Their moment of fame came early. In 1940, paratroopers played a decisive role in the invasion of Western Europe, capturing key bridges and strongpoints. A year later, during the Battle of Crete, they executed the first large-scale airborne invasion in history. It worked, but at a terrible cost. Out of roughly 22,000 paratroopers deployed, more than 6,000 were killed or wounded in just days of fighting. Losses were so severe that German leadership effectively ended large airborne assaults afterward. From that point on, paratroopers were increasingly used as elite ground infantry. They fought in North Africa, Italy, and later in the desperate defensive battles of Western Europe. Though still highly trained, they no longer had the advantage of surprise from the air. Equipment remained light by necessity, heavy weapons were limited, and resupply was often unreliable. Yet paratroopers developed a reputation for stubborn defense. In places like Monte Cassino, small airborne units held positions against repeated Allied assaults, inflicting heavy casualties on attackers while suffering devastating losses themselves. Paratroopers represented both the ambition and the limits of German military innovation. They proved what bold ideas could achieve, but also how unforgiving modern war had become when surprise failed and losses could not be replaced. Security infantry. While elite units fought for headlines at the front, another kind of infantry operated far from the spotlight. Security infantry did not chase breakthroughs or hold heroic last stands. Their battlefield was the rear, and their mission was control. These units were tasked with guarding supply lines, railways, depots, and occupied territory. On paper, their role sounded defensive. In reality, security infantry became deeply involved in anti-partisan warfare, a brutal and ambiguous form of combat that blurred the line between soldier and occupier. Security infantry divisions were usually smaller and more lightly equipped than frontline formations, often numbering 8,000 to 12,000 men. Many were composed of older soldiers, wounded veterans, or troops considered unfit for frontline duty. Heavy weapons were scarce, mobility was limited. What they had instead was authority over vast areas. Their importance grew rapidly on the Eastern Front, where partisan activity expanded behind German lines. Rail sabotage, ambushes, and intelligence leaks forced German command to divert tens of thousands of troops away from the front just to keep supply routes open. In some regions, entire security divisions were tied down indefinitely. Losses mounted quietly. Casualties from ambushes, mines, and constant low-intensity fighting accumulated year after year. More importantly, these units were drawn into increasingly harsh reprisals against civilian populations, actions that hardened resistance rather than suppressing it. By 1943, the strain became visible. Security infantry units were overstretched, undermanned, and fighting an enemy that blended into the population. They could control territory, but rarely pacify it. Security infantry reveal a crucial truth of modern warfare. Winning battles at the front means little if the rear collapses. And in occupied Europe, holding the rear proved just as costly and far more corrosive. Static infantry. As Germany lost the initiative, movement gave way to defense. This was the moment when static infantry became increasingly visible. Static infantry units were designed for one purpose: to hold ground without moving. These divisions were assigned to coastal defenses, fortified cities, and critical choke points where retreat was not expected or permitted. Mobility was sacrificed almost entirely. Many units had no organic transport at all. A typical static infantry division was smaller than frontline formations, often numbering 10,000 to 12,000 men. Equipment was uneven. Some units had strong defensive firepower, including heavy machine guns and fixed artillery positions. Others relied on outdated weapons and captured equipment. What they all shared was a lack of flexibility. Their most famous deployment was along the Atlantic Wall, stretching from Norway to the French coast. When the Allied landings began in June 1944, static infantry units were the first to face the assault. Pinned in bunkers and trenches, many were overwhelmed within hours. In Normandy alone, several divisions suffered over 50% casualties in the opening phase of the invasion. Static infantry also defended cities declared fortresses. Once encircled, these units were expected to fight to the last man. Resupply was unreliable, relief was rare, losses accumulated rapidly, often ending in annihilation or surrender. These troops were not meant to win battles, they were meant to buy time Germany no longer had. Static infantry represent the point where strategy narrowed to survival, and holding ground became more important than maneuver. In static warfare, courage was measured not by advance, but by endurance. Naval infantry. By the later years of the war, Germany faced a problem it could no longer hide. There were not enough soldiers. As fronts collapsed and casualties mounted, the military began pulling manpower from unexpected places, including the Navy. This was how naval infantry emerged. Naval infantry units were formed from sailors who had never been trained to fight as infantry. Many had spent years aboard ships, submarines, or coastal installations. Suddenly, they found themselves issued rifles and sent to defend ports, coastal cities, and eventually inland battlefields. These formations varied widely in size, but many fielded 8,000 to 10,000 men, often with minimal infantry training. Their equipment reflected desperation rather than doctrine. Some units had access to naval artillery repurposed for ground defense. Others relied on outdated weapons and limited ammunition. Coordination was uneven, and experience in land combat was scarce. Their primary role was coastal defense, protecting harbors, shipyards, and naval bases from Allied landings. But as the situation worsened in 1944 and 1945, naval infantry units were increasingly thrown into frontline combat. In places like northern Germany and the Baltic coast, sailors fought as foot soldiers against advancing Allied and Soviet forces. Losses were severe. Accustomed to rigid naval discipline but not fluid ground combat, many units suffered heavy casualties in their first engagements. Some formations disintegrated under pressure. Others fought stubbornly, clinging to defensive positions long after relief was impossible. Naval infantry symbolized a critical turning point. When sailors were fighting as infantry, it was no longer about strategy or innovation. It was about survival, using every remaining human resource to delay the inevitable. At this stage of the war, Germany was no longer choosing how to fight, it was simply choosing where to fall back. Militia. By late 1944, the German army had reached its breaking point. The fronts were collapsing, cities were under constant bombardment, and trained soldiers were no longer available. In desperation, the regime turned to its last reserve, the militia. This force was not built. It was summoned. Teenagers, elderly men, civil servants, factory workers, many with no real military training, were suddenly issued weapons and ordered to defend their hometowns. Organization was minimal. Training, when it existed at all, often lasted only days. Militia units varied wildly in size and capability. Some formations numbered a few hundred men, others several thousand. Equipment was inconsistent and often obsolete. Rifles from World War I, captured weapons, and limited ammunition were common. Heavy weapons were rare, and coordination with regular forces was almost non-existent. Their role was simple and grim: delay the enemy. In cities like Berlin, militia fighters were thrown into street battles against experienced Allied and Soviet troops. Casualties were catastrophic. In many engagements, entire units ceased to exist within hours. Losses on both sides mounted rapidly, but the outcome was never in doubt. Despite this, militia resistance occasionally slowed advances, forcing attackers to fight block by block. But these moments did not change the war. They only increased the human cost of its final days. Militia represents the final stage of total war, when ideology demands sacrifice long after strategy has failed. It marked the point where the German war effort was no longer about victory or even survival, but about postponing defeat at any price. And when the militia fell, there was nothing left to take its place. World War II was not decided by machines alone, but by the men who fought on foot, across forests, mountains, cities, and finally, the ruins of entire nations. Understanding these infantry forces helps us understand how the war was truly fought. If you found this breakdown clear and valuable, please like the video, share it with others who care about history, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explanations of World War II, focused on structure, strategy, and the human cost behind the battles. Your support helps keep this channel alive and allows us to continue producing accurate, well-researched historical content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.